I used to believe that love from your parents was automatic, like the sun rising every morning. I thought their love would be constant, dependable, and warm. But what happens when the very people who brought you into this world decide you aren't worthy of that love? What happens when you realize you've been standing outside a house that was never going to open its doors for you? Growing up, my life felt like an endless audition I was destined to fail. My parents, especially my mother, treated love as something to be earned, not something to be given freely. I chased their approval like a thirsty traveler crawling toward a mirage. Every good grade, every perfect recital, every forced smile, it was all a desperate attempt to finally hear the words I ached for. We're proud of you. We love you. But those words never came. Instead, my childhood was filled with silence that screamed. My mother had a gift for coldness. Her disapproval wasn't loud. It was the sharp sting of being ignored. She would speak over me, about me, but rarely to me. I became an accessory in family photos, a placeholder at the dinner table. My father wasn't cruel, but he was distant, retreating into his work, leaving my mother to decide who deserved affection in our home. Spoiler: it was never me. The hardest part wasn't the harsh words, it was the absence of words. It was the empty seats at my school performances, the forgotten birthdays, the constant comparisons to my older brother who could do no wrong. I remember once, at 10 years old, I won first place in a statewide art competition. I ran home clutching the blue ribbon like it was my ticket into their hearts. My mother glanced at it, shrugged, and said, "Art doesn't pay the bills." She went back to folding laundry, and I quietly slipped the ribbon into a drawer I never opened again. That was the first time I realized love could have conditions. Over time, I stopped trying to win them over, not because I stopped caring, but because I couldn't survive the constant rejection. It changes you. It rewires your brain. When the people who are supposed to protect you consistently push you away, you start to believe you are fundamentally unlovable. I wore that belief like a second skin. I became a master of self-sabotage, turning away friends, ending relationships before they could reject me first. I told myself I didn't need anyone, but deep down, I was starving for connection. I remember watching other families' classmates who would talk about Sunday dinners, family vacations, handwritten birthday cards, and I felt like I was watching a movie I would never be cast in. I wondered what it would feel like to be chosen, to be wanted just because I exist. I buried that longing beneath layers of sarcasm and emotional distance. It was easier to pretend I didn't care than to sit with the ache of being unwanted. But the truth is, I did care. I cared so much it consumed me. There were nights I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, asking myself questions no child should have to ask. What's wrong with me? Why can't they love me the way I need? What am I missing? I dissected myself piece by piece, convinced that if I just figured out the flaw, I could fix it, and maybe then they'd finally see me. The flaw, I eventually realized, was never me. The flaw was their inability to love without limits. But it took years of pain, years of chasing people who treated me like an option, years of believing I had to prove my worth over and over again before I saw that truth. Parental rejection doesn't leave visible bruises, but it shapes your entire worldview. It seeps into how you see yourself, how you love others, how you accept love from others. For a long time, I believed I was broken. Now, I understand I was simply starved of what I deserved. Telling this story is still hard. Even now, as I let these memories pour out, part of me wonders if sharing this will make people think less of me, like I'm airing secrets that should stay buried. But I've come to learn that silence only keeps us trapped in shame, and I've been silent long enough. This is the truth. I was rejected by my parents. Not once, not in a moment of anger, but over and over, in quiet ways that cut the deepest. And yet, I'm still here. I survived. I'm learning, slowly, that I don't need to keep knocking on locked doors. Somewhere along the way, I realized I could build my own home, one where I belong, one where love doesn't come with conditions. This isn't just my story. It's the story of so many people who grew up believing they were unworthy because their parents failed to see their light. And if you've ever felt this way, if you've ever been on the outside, begging to be let in, I want you to know you are enough. You always have been. Some people think that pain always looks like bruises or broken bones. They imagine screaming, shouting, maybe even slammed doors. But the deepest pain I carry isn't something anyone could have seen. It's silent. It's the ache that lingers when no one bothers to look your way. It's the weight of being invisible to the people who should have loved you the loudest. When I was a little girl, I thought being unnoticed was temporary, that if I just worked a little harder, they would eventually see me. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, coloring while my mother flipped through magazines, her eyes sliding past me like I was part of the furniture. I would hold up my drawings, small hands shaking with hope, waiting for her to meet my eyes, to smile, to say, "That's beautiful." But most of the time, she didn't even glance up. I used to think maybe she was just busy. Maybe tomorrow would be different. But tomorrow never came. It's strange how silence can be louder than words. When your parents criticize you, at least they're acknowledging you exist. But when they ignore you, you start to question if you're even real to them. I used to stare at my reflection, wondering if I was just a shadow that accidentally wandered into their lives. I can still hear the sound of my mother praising my brother at dinner, how smart he was, how proud she was of his achievements. I sat across the table, small and quiet, feeling like a ghost in my own home. I wanted so badly to interrupt, to tell a story, to just be part of the conversation. But every time I tried, my mother would either talk over me or give me that look, that dismissive glance that told me my words were not worth the air it took to speak them. Those moments carved themselves into me. I remember birthdays spent blowing out candles in silence because no one remembered, school events where I scanned the crowd, desperate to spot their faces, only to realize they never showed up. It wasn't the absence of gifts that hurt, it was the absence of their presence. I would sit in the back seat on long car rides while my parents talked endlessly about work, about errands, about anything but me. I could have vanished from that seat and I don't think they would have noticed. The worst part is, I internalized all of it. When you're a child, you don't have the tools to understand neglect. You don't think. Maybe they're emotionally unavailable. No, you think. There must be something wrong with me. I became an expert at self-blame. I picked myself apart relentlessly. Maybe if I were prettier, funnier, more talented, they would love me. I thought I had to earn their attention, so I performed. I excelled in school. I volunteered. I tried to be perfect. But perfection didn't change anything. Even as I grew older, the pattern followed me like a shadow. I found myself in friendships where I was always the giver, always the one chasing. I dated people who treated me like I was optional because that was familiar. I confused being tolerated with being loved. I didn't know what it felt like to be someone's first choice, because I had never been my parents' first choice. And here's the thing. No one tells you when you've been emotionally starved for so long. You start settling for crumbs. You convince yourself that minimal attention is enough, that you should be grateful someone even remembered your name. I carried that mindset like a wound that wouldn't close. But even though I looked functional on the outside, the damage was there. It showed up in the way I over-explained myself, in the way I apologized for existing, in the way I feared that every relationship would eventually evaporate. I was waiting for people to abandon me, because that was the story I had always known. What no one saw were the nights I would cry without understanding why. The quiet panic attacks in the bathroom where I would stare at myself and feel like I was fading. The invisible wounds don't bleed, but they shape everything. They teach you to make yourself small, to not ask for too much, to not expect love without conditions. There was a moment in my mid-20s that cracked me open. I was walking home from work, just a random Tuesday, when it hit me like a tidal wave. I had spent my entire life begging for scraps from people who had no intention of feeding me. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, tears flooding my eyes, realizing I had become a prisoner in a cage I didn't even know I was building. That moment didn't heal me, but it woke me up. I started to peel back the layers of who I thought I was. I realized that the story my parents told me that I was unworthy, that I didn't matter, was not my story to carry. It was their limitation, not my identity. I began to see that the love I craved could start with me, that I didn't need their approval to take up space in this world. The invisible wounds, they don't just disappear, but they can heal, slowly, sometimes painfully, but they can heal. And if you're carrying wounds like mine, if you've ever felt unseen, unloved, or dismissed, please hear me when I say you are not invisible. You never were. You are worthy of being seen, of being cherished, and of writing your own story where you are the main character, not a shadow in someone else's life. If you've never been through it, you might think grief is something you only experience when someone dies. But I learned, painfully, that grief can consume you when someone is still alive, when you have to mourn the relationship you'll never have, the parents who are physically present but emotionally gone. For most of my life, I didn't even know I was grieving. I thought I was just angry. Angry at the cold stares, angry at the walls they built between us, angry that they chose distance when I would have settled for even the smallest breadcrumb of affection. But beneath that anger, there was a different monster, one that crept quietly, wrapping itself around me. It started with denial. I built excuses for them so well I could have been their lawyer. They're just busy. They love me in their own way. It's me I'm asking for too much. I convinced myself that my mother's indifference was a cultural thing. Or maybe she was just stressed. Or maybe I wasn't as easy to love as my brother. I held tightly to the fantasy that if I kept being patient, if I kept performing, one day I'd get the version of them I had always needed. But reality has sharp edges, and the longer I denied what was happening, the deeper I cut myself on those edges. When the cracks in my fantasy became too big to ignore, the denial morphed into rage, pure, hot rage. I would slam doors, snap at people who didn't deserve it, carry this unbearable fire inside of me that had no clear direction. I was furious at them for making me feel disposable. I was furious at myself for not walking away sooner. I was furious at the world for letting parents like mine exist. But anger is a tricky thing. It's easier to feel than sadness. Anger gave me something to hold, a shield to hide behind. It felt like power in a life where I had always been powerless. Then came bargaining. I wish I could say I was above this phase, but I wasn't. I remember calling my mom one day, rehearsing the conversation in my head, thinking maybe if I just phrased things the right way, if I just told her how much she hurt me, she would finally understand. Maybe, just maybe, she would apologize. But the apology never came. What I got instead was a cold shrug, a quiet dismissal. Why are you bringing up old things? You're too sensitive. That shattered something in me. The next few years were heavy with sadness. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of sadness that makes you sob on the floor. It was quieter, more suffocating. I lost interest in things I used to love. My body showed up for life, but my soul stayed somewhere else, curled up in the dark. I stopped answering calls. I drifted from friends. I started avoiding mirrors because I couldn't stand to look at someone who felt so profoundly unwanted. I would scroll through social media, watching people post about their amazing moms and supportive dads, and it felt like pressing on a bruise that would never heal. I didn't envy their perfect lives, I just ached for something even remotely close to what they had. I carried that ache like a stone in my chest, and for a long time, I thought I would carry it forever. But then, slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice, it began to shift. I don't remember a single moment when I decided to accept it. It wasn't like a sunrise suddenly bursting through the darkness. It was more like the quiet rhythm of ocean waves slowly smoothing jagged rocks. Tiny realizations stacked on top of each other. I realized I was allowed to grieve what I never had. I realized I didn't need to keep fighting for their approval to have worth. I realized that I had the power to build something better, something softer, for myself. Acceptance wasn't a peaceful arrival. It wasn't a warm hug. It was just a quiet surrender, a recognition that I couldn't rewrite the past, but I could choose how to live with it. And the truth is, I still have moments where the grief sneaks back in. Sometimes I'll see a father and daughter laughing at a coffee shop, or I'll hear a friend talk about calling their mom for advice, and it hits me all over again, the longing, the sting, the grief that love never arrived for me in the form I hoped it would. But I've learned to let those feelings pass through me instead of getting trapped inside them. I've learned that healing isn't a straight line, it loops, it spirals, it revisits old wounds in new ways. The most profound part of this journey realizing that I am not broken. I am not broken because they couldn't love me properly. I am not defined by their absence. I don't have to keep replaying the story where I'm the little girl waiting by the window, hoping they'll show up. I get to write new chapters now, chapters where I choose myself, where I surround myself with people who see me, who hear me, who show up not because they have to, but because they want to. And maybe, just maybe, the truest form of peace is knowing I survived the storm without their umbrella. When the dust finally settled after the denial, the rage, the sadness, the long years of hoping for something that would never come, I was left staring at myself in a cracked mirror, wondering who I was without their voices echoing in my head. I had spent so long chasing their approval that I never built a relationship with the one person who would always be with me myself. The truth is, when the foundation you were raised on crumbles, you either learn to build again or you live among the ruins. For a long time, I didn't know how to build. I sat there, emotionally paralyzed, surrounded by broken pieces, shards of self-worth, fragments of old stories that told me I wasn't enough. I didn't know where to begin. I didn't know if I deserved to begin. I believed that love was something to be earned. That's what my parents taught me, in their own quiet, brutal way. They never said it out loud, but their actions screamed it. Be perfect. Be useful. Be exactly who we want you to be, or be invisible. Even after I stopped seeking their attention, I carried their conditional love into every corner of my life. I poured myself into my work, thinking that success would finally make me lovable. I overgave in relationships, thinking that if I just did enough, maybe someone would finally choose me without hesitation. But no matter how much I achieved, no matter how much I gave, the emptiness followed me like a shadow. Because the truth is, no one else's love can fill the void that comes from abandoning yourself. There was one moment that changed everything. It was painfully small, something most people would forget by the next day, but it cracked open something inside me. I was sitting alone in my apartment, scrolling through old photos. I came across a picture of myself at around 7 years old. I was sitting on the swing set in our backyard. A wide, hopeful smile stretched across my face, looking directly at whoever had been behind the camera. And I realized something that hit me like a tidal wave. That little girl had done nothing wrong. She didn't need to earn love. She didn't deserve the silence, the coldness, the constant rejection. For the first time, I saw her clearly. I saw me. I sat there for a long time that night, tears streaming down my face, apologizing to the girl in that photo not for what happened to her, but for how I had continued her story. I had continued to treat myself the way they treated me, as if I wasn't enough. That was the night I made a quiet, trembling promise. I promised to stop abandoning her. I promised to start showing up for her the way no one else ever did. But self-love isn't a grand gesture. It isn't a one-time decision. It's thousands of small choices made every day, often when no one is watching. It started with the basics, like letting myself rest without guilt, saying no without explaining, letting myself eat the dessert I wanted instead of restricting myself to earn some invisible approval. It meant cutting off people who only loved the version of me that served them. It meant changing the way I talked to myself. The voices in my head, the ones that told me I wasn't good enough, that I was a burden, that I needed to be perfect to deserve love, didn't come from nowhere. They had been carefully planted by years of emotional neglect. I realized I had been repeating those same toxic mantras to myself. So I started fighting back. I began gently, catching the moments when I criticized myself for tiny mistakes, and choosing a different response. When I wanted to say, "You're so stupid," I replaced it with, "You're learning. You're human. You're doing your best." It felt unnatural at first. I didn't believe the kinder words, but I kept saying them. I kept choosing them. Over time, they became a little easier to believe. I began writing letters to my younger self, pages, and pages where I told her all the things she needed to hear. You matter. You are loved. You don't need to prove anything to deserve care. Some nights I would read those letters aloud. I would hold the photo of that little girl, and I would say those words as if she were sitting right in front of me. I started creating small rituals that honored me. Morning walks without my phone. Lighting candles in my apartment just because I deserved a peaceful space. Buying myself flowers on random Tuesdays. These weren't about filling an Instagram feed, they were about learning to show myself tenderness in ways no one else ever had. And slowly, something inside me softened. I don't want to romanticize the journey. There are still days when I slip back into old patterns, when I overwork, when I overgive, when I still catch myself wishing my parents would call and say they miss me. But now I recognize those moments, and when they come, I don't abandon myself anymore. I pause. I breathe. I remind myself I choose me now. Loving myself isn't a destination I've arrived at, it's a relationship I'm building, brick by brick, moment by moment. And maybe that's the most radical thing any of us can do, especially when we've been taught that we're unworthy to look in the mirror, with all our scars, and say, I am worth loving, exactly as I am. For most of my life, I believed that I had to carry everything alone. I thought strength meant isolation, that if I could handle the weight of my sadness by myself, I was somehow proving my worth. I wore my independence like a badge. But the truth is, it was more like armor, heavy, exhausting, slowly suffocating me. When you grow up feeling like you're too much for your family, you start to believe you'll be too much for everyone else too. I convinced myself that no one wanted to hear about my pain. I became an expert at changing the subject, hiding the parts of me that ached, laughing off moments when I was actually breaking inside. But there's a limit to how long you can live that way. The turning point came in the most unexpected place, sitting in a small, quiet therapist's office with a stranger who, for the first time in my life, actually wanted to hear my story. It took me years to walk into that room. I kept telling myself I was fine, that I didn't need therapy, that other people had it worse. I pushed the idea away until one day I realized I had nowhere else to go with my pain. It was either finally ask for help or keep drowning in silence. I still remember my first session, how I sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, arms crossed like I was preparing for battle. I told my story the way I always did, detached, rehearsed, as if it had happened to someone else. I fully expected the therapist to brush it off, to minimize it, the way my parents always had. But she didn't. She leaned in, looked me in the eyes, and said the words that cracked me wide open. That was not okay. You deserved better. No one had ever said that to me before. It was like someone finally opened a window in a house that had been sealed shut for years. In that room, I didn't have to defend my feelings. I didn't have to prove my pain was valid. I could just exist, as I was, without needing to earn my place. Therapy became the first safe space I ever had. It was the starting point, but it wasn't the whole journey. Outside of those four walls, I had to learn how to let other people in. I used to think vulnerability was dangerous, that if I let people see the raw, unpolished parts of me, they'd run away like everyone else did. But I started testing the waters with friends, sharing small, honest pieces of my story. I remember sitting with my friend Alyssa one evening, sipping coffee, when I finally told her about the years of being invisible in my own family. I braced for the familiar discomfort, for the awkward silence, but instead, she reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and simply said, "I see you." That moment changed everything. It taught me that there are people who won't flinch at your honesty, people who will stay, people who will love you not in spite of your wounds, but because you trusted them enough to show them. I began slowly building a circle of those people friends who became family, mentors who guided me, even distant relatives who offered a kind of warmth I'd never known from my parents. I stopped chasing the family I was born into, and I started choosing the family I would build. I made a conscious decision to let go of the idea that healing had to look a certain way. I allowed myself to find support in unexpected places, support groups, quiet conversations, even online communities where strangers became lifelines. Some of the people who helped me most never knew the depth of their impact: a kind barista who remembered my order, a coworker who noticed when I was struggling, a neighbor who smiled at me every morning. Those small moments of human connection reminded me that I was not as alone as I believed. But building a new circle also meant setting boundaries with people who drained me. I learned to recognize when I was falling back into old patterns: over-giving, over-explaining, shrinking myself to fit into relationships that didn't deserve me. The people I kept close were the ones who loved me without conditions, the ones who didn't need me to be perfect, the ones who stayed when I was messy, when I was grieving, when I wasn't the easiest person to be around. They taught me that love could be safe, that I could lean on someone without collapsing, that I didn't always have to be the strong one. And most importantly, they taught me that I was worthy not because I earned it, not because I performed well enough, but simply because I existed. Sometimes we don't get to rewrite our family of origin story. Sometimes the people who should have loved us just won't. But that doesn't mean we have to spend our lives starving. We can build something new. We can find people who will sit with us in the dark, who will celebrate us in the light, who will remind us on the hard days you are seen, you are valued, you are loved. And the most beautiful part, we get to choose them. We get to choose us. For most of my life, I thought family was something you couldn't change. It was a fixed category, like blood type or eye color, something you were born into, something you were expected to accept no matter how much it hurt you. I believed that family meant loyalty, even when it came at the expense of my own well-being. I believed that walking away from family was the ultimate betrayal, even when they were the ones who had been betraying me all along. But life has a way of cracking open the walls you build around your definitions. The truth is, I spent years forcing myself to sit at tables where I was never truly welcome. I endured holidays surrounded by people who saw me as an afterthought. Birthdays where the most I could hope for was a lukewarm text message. I held on because I thought I had to, that this was what family was supposed to be. But somewhere along the way, the weight of pretending became unbearable. The shift didn't happen in a dramatic explosion. It came slowly, in quiet, uncomfortable realizations. One of the moments I remember vividly was a Christmas dinner a few years ago. I sat there, surrounded by people who shared my last name, but I had never felt more alone. Conversations swirled around me, but no one really asked how I was doing. No one noticed when I quietly left the table halfway through dessert. I went home that night, sat on my couch, and asked myself a question I had spent years avoiding. Why am I forcing myself to stay loyal to people who don't show up for me? The question haunted me. For a while, I spiraled in guilt. Society has this way of glorifying family above all else. Like blood automatically earns trust and love. I was terrified of what it would mean to step away, to admit that, maybe, just maybe, The family I was born into wasn't capable of loving me the way I needed. But slowly, I started to explore a different truth. Family isn't just blood. Family is where you are seen. Family is where you are safe. I looked around and realized I had already started building that family, piece by piece, without even knowing it. There was Alyssa, my best friend since college, who remembered the details my parents always forgot, who called me on the morning of my big presentations, who showed up with soup when I was sick, who held me when I sobbed in parking lots. There was Marcus, my former coworker who became my sounding board, who would sit with me for hours talking about nothing and everything, who never made me feel like I had to earn his time. There was Mrs. Carter, my elderly neighbor, who brought me homemade bread every Sunday and listened to my stories like they mattered. These people didn't share my DNA, but they chose me, over and over, and I chose them. I started to redefine what family meant for me. Family became the people who asked the hard questions, the ones who didn't look away when I was in pain, the ones who celebrated not just my achievements but my ordinary days. It was terrifying to let go of the story I had been told my entire life, that real family is forever, no matter how they treat you. It felt like shedding skin that had been glued to me for years, but once I allowed myself to release that narrative, I felt lighter. Redefining family didn't mean erasing where I came from. It meant expanding my definition to include the people who actually filled my cup, not the ones who kept draining it. I learned to create intentional spaces in my life. I hosted my own family dinners with the people I loved, friends who brought their own dishes, who laughed loudly, who asked me to pass the salt and genuinely cared about the answer when they asked, "How are you doing?" Really? We built our own rituals: Tuesday movie nights, Sunday morning walks, random phone calls just to check in. It was never grand or flashy, but it was real. It was steady. It was home. And in the quiet moments, I started to realize that I didn't miss my biological family as much as I thought I would. I missed the idea of them, the dream version I had always chased, the version I now understood didn't exist. Grieving that dream was hard, but it made space for something else, something better. It made space for a family I chose, and who chose me back, not because of shared blood, but because of shared hearts. Sometimes people ask me if I regret stepping away from my parents. It's a complicated answer. I wish it had been different. I wish they had been the people I needed them to be, but I don't regret choosing myself. I don't regret building something new. I used to believe family was something you inherited. Now I know family is something you create. And the most beautiful part, it doesn't have to look like anyone else's version. It just has to feel like home. For so long, I lived inside a story that I didn't write. I was handed a script the moment I was born, a quiet, invisible set of rules that told me who I was supposed to be, what I was allowed to feel, and how much space I was permitted to take up in this world. I was the forgotten daughter, the not quite enough, the afterthought. I wore those titles like a second skin, believing they were the only story available to me. But somewhere along the way, I realized I didn't have to keep reading from that same, tired script. The first spark of this realization came after I started doing the work to heal, not just going to therapy or surrounding myself with new people, but really sitting with the uncomfortable truth that I had been living my life based on other people's definitions of who I was. The voice in my head wasn't even mine. It belonged to my mother's coldness, my father's silence. All those years of being told I was too sensitive, too demanding, too much of a burden, and without even realizing it, I had let those voices write the chapters of my life. I worked jobs I didn't love because I thought success meant stability, and stability meant worthiness. I dated people who fit neatly into what I thought was acceptable. I played small in conversations, in relationships, in rooms where I was terrified of being fully seen. Because deep down, I still thought I was the girl who didn't matter. The moment everything began to shift was so simple it almost feels insignificant now. I was sitting on a park bench, watching people pass by strangers with coffees, mothers with strollers, friends laughing about something I couldn't hear. I realized, in that quiet space, that all of them were living stories I knew nothing about. Some were probably weighed down by invisible grief. Some were probably in love. Some were probably, like me, trying to figure out who they were without the labels that had been handed to them. That's when it hit me I could choose a new story. I could write a different ending. The power was always mine. But rewriting a story isn't as easy as deciding one morning that you're healed. It's 1,000 tiny rebellions. It's catching yourself when you almost shrink back into your old identity and choosing to stand tall instead. It's making decisions that align with who you are becoming, not who you've been told to be. I started by asking myself questions I had never dared to answer before. What do I want? What brings me joy? What would my life look like if I stopped living to be acceptable to other people? At first, I didn't know the answers. That's the thing about losing yourself. You don't always know what you're looking for until you stumble across it. So I experimented. I signed up for a pottery class, something I had always told myself I wasn't creative enough to try. I booked a solo trip to a city I had never visited, just to prove to myself that I could take up space in this world alone and still be whole. I started saying no to jobs that drained me, no to relationships that made me feel small, no to obligations that didn't feed my soul. Each choice, no matter how small, stitched together a new chapter. And slowly, I found that my story didn't have to be about abandonment or rejection anymore. It could be about rediscovery. It could be about courage. It could be about building a life that felt like mine, not the one I inherited, but the one I consciously created. One of the most liberating moments came when I realized I didn't need their permission to be happy. I had spent years waiting for my parents to change, waiting for an apology, waiting for them to suddenly see me. But waiting kept me trapped. So I stopped. I stopped waiting for their approval to pursue what set my heart on fire. I stopped waiting for their validation to believe I was worthy. I stopped waiting for them to rewrite their story so I could finally begin mine. I reclaimed the pen. And here's what I know now. Rewriting your story doesn't erase what came before. It doesn't delete the pain, or the chapters where you were small, or the pages soaked in grief. It simply means you no longer let those moments dictate where the story goes next. I carry my past with me, but I don't live there anymore. I've written new chapters, ones filled with chosen family, with self-compassion, with mornings where I wake up and genuinely look forward to the day ahead. I've created a life that feels like mine in the most authentic, soul-deep way. And if you've ever felt stuck inside a story that was written for you, I want you to know this: you don't have to stay there. You don't have to keep playing the same role. You can walk off the stage. You can pick up the pen. You can write something breathtakingly new. It's not too late. It's never too late to choose yourself. For a long time, I thought forgiveness meant letting someone off the hook. I thought it was a gift you gave to the person who hurt you, a quiet way of saying, "It's okay. We can pretend this didn't happen." I told myself I could never do that. I would never do that. How could I possibly forgive my parents? How could I let go of all those years spent waiting by the phone? All those birthdays they forgot? All those silent dinners where I sat right next to them but felt a million miles away? I thought holding on to the pain made me strong. I thought if I stayed angry, I was protecting myself from ever being hurt again. But what I didn't realize was that the anger wasn't just a shield, it was a prison. I had locked myself inside my own resentment, and somewhere along the way, I threw away the key. The first time someone suggested forgiveness to me in therapy, I practically laughed. Forgive them. For what? For making me feel like a stranger in my own home, for pretending I didn't matter, I told my therapist. They don't deserve my forgiveness. She looked at me so gently and said, "Maybe the forgiveness isn't for them." That sentence followed me for months. I turned it over in my head on long walks, in quiet grocery store aisles, while brushing my teeth. I didn't want it to be true. I wanted my pain to stay righteous. I wanted the injustice to feel sharp, because if I let it soften, I was afraid I would be betraying the version of me who had survived all of it. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized something I hadn't seen before. Holding on to all that bitterness didn't change the past. It didn't make them love me. It didn't make the rejection less real. All it did was make me carry them with me everywhere I went. They lived in the back of my mind, in the quiet corners of my heart, in the way I flinched when someone got too close emotionally. They had taken enough from me. I didn't want to give them my future, too. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about giving them a clean slate. It was about setting myself free. It was about releasing the chokehold their absence had on my life. It was about loosening the grip of those old stories that whispered, "You are unlovable. You are unwanted." So I started small. I didn't call them. I didn't write a letter. I didn't try to rebuild something that was never really built to last. My forgiveness began quietly, in the privacy of my own thoughts. I would catch myself spiraling into old memories, rehearsing all the things I wished I had said, and I would gently tell myself, "You don't have to live there anymore." I started choosing peace, even when anger tried to knock on my door. Forgiveness isn't neat. It isn't a single, beautiful moment where you suddenly feel lighter. It's a process, a muscle you have to keep stretching. Some days, I wake up and I feel the weight of their absence pressing on my chest again. Some days, the old sadness seeps back in, but now, instead of feeding it, I acknowledge it, and I let it pass. There was a time when I believed healing meant erasing the pain. Now I know that healing means carrying the pain differently. The most surprising part of this journey was discovering hope, real, living, breathing hope where I thought I would only find grief. Hope showed up in the small things: the morning sun warming my face through the window, the laughter shared with my chosen family, the comfort of sitting alone in my apartment and actually feeling at home in my own skin. Hope showed up when I realized that even though my parents couldn't give me the love I needed, the world still had so much love to offer me. I just had to be willing to see it. I used to think I would carry this wound forever, and in a way, I do. It's a part of me, but it no longer controls me. It no longer defines me. I've rewritten my story. I've built a life I never thought was possible, a life filled with connection, with purpose, with the freedom to take up space without apology. And I've learned that sometimes the most profound revenge isn't proving them wrong, it's choosing to live well. It's choosing to love yourself with the tenderness they withheld. It's choosing to forgive not for them, but for you. Forgiveness is not about forgetting what happened. It's about refusing to let it poison what's still to come. So, to the person reading this who might be carrying their own ache, who might be sitting in the ruins of what they wished family would be, I want you to know that your story doesn't end here. There is hope waiting for you. There is freedom in releasing what you no longer need to carry. And there is a beautiful life waiting for you, not because you have to earn it, not because you have to prove anything, but simply because you are worthy of living it. I found my peace. I found my way home. You can too.